Yeah, please raise your hand up, please. Raise your hand.
I'm not going to swear.
I don't think we need to swear the witness
Oh,
if
no
there's
swear.
not going to be any factual evidence presented.
Good evening. So I went through the proposed regulations pretty carefully, and it is a really nice job that was done on this. This is not simple language, and I think you guys navigated it quite well. I do have 6 issues. Some of them are minor, some of them are not so minor. I'm more than willing to be interrupted if you have questions on each one of them. Some of them will be very obvious. Some of them might require a little bit of conversation. So issue number 1, and I'm just going to pull out my copy here so that you can follow along if necessary. On the first page, 1.3, letter E, defines election day as meaning any time the polls are open for the conduct of an election, primary, or referendum. I've always been a little bit confused by that language because the polls are effectively open for much more than just on the day of election now. We have emergency balloting that basically occurs for many days before the election. So I was just wondering about this particular definition and what it actually means, because in existing legislation, the polls are and elections are basically defined more or less as the day of the election. But I'm sorry, Commissioner Erickson, I'm on page 1, number E, and I'm just starting looking at some things. And you
My
also
lights were on, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry?
My lights were on.
Okay, no problem. You also missed that I said that a very nice job was done in promulgating these rules. So I'm just wondering if there needs to be a little bit clearer definition of what is meant by any time the polls are open, and what that specifically refers to, whether it just means the polls open on the day of the election, or people casting ballots, emergency ballots at boards of canvassers, that sort of thing. So that was just a basic question about that definition. My next issue is on page 2, letter H. Even though NVRA is not referred to anywhere else in this document, there is no definition for the Help America Vote Act, which is also not referenced anywhere else in the document. And since this document is promulgating rules that effectuate what the Help America Vote Act has, I just wanted to point out it just seemed a little bit weird that one of those very important laws was mentioned and the other one was not. I would suggest maybe you might just want to define them both in there, since they're both very relevant to what's happening here in this set of rules. So on page 6, things get a little bit more complex to discuss. And on page 6, the paragraph I'm referring to is B1A, which begins with in-person in quotes. And the issue, I'm gonna boil it down to a single sentence on what my concern is, and then I'll describe a little bit why. The effect of this paragraph makes voters who register to vote through the web, it classifies them as being considered to have registered to vote in person. And I think that's a misclassification of someone who registers that way. The Help America Vote Act carves a clear distinction between voters who not cast a vote, but who register to vote. When voters who register to vote in person, they're handing their voter registration to an elections official, right? That's in person. As opposed to by mail, when somebody just puts a registration in the mail and sends it in, now you have a little bit less direct, actually you have no direct knowledge and interaction of the person who puts that registration in the mail with the elections official who receives it. And then the Help America Vote Act continues to say, well, in those circumstances, if certain information is missing for voters who register by mail, we require you to do some other things because of this indirection. In the case of voters who are registering through the web, there's not a more indirect way to register to vote. You're not even putting a signature on your application when you register to vote through the web. it is the most indirect, least concrete way that we have to receive a voter registration from an individual. And because of that, I believe it should not be classified anyway as in person. It should be really classified and treated as if it's indirect, either in a mail classification or maybe you need to create a new classification for it. And one of my concerns is the cybersecurity risk that exists when you do the registrations by mail, by the web, as opposed to doing them by mail, as opposed to doing them in person. As we move further into cybersecurity and bad actors, whether they're individuals or whether they're nations or nation states or whatever, I believe that we really want to be careful about how we classify this and what we do moving forward. And having them classified as in person, I think, is wrong in this case, and I strongly urge you to consider reclassifying some other way. And I don't know if you have any questions about that one, or if you want me to move on. Okay. My next issue is on page 8, and it is paragraph 3A, which starts with a copy of a current and valid photo registration, photo identification. And it's the entirety of that paragraph, and it goes on to page 9.
Beginning of which number, I'm sorry?
This is on page 8, 3.A. And it starts a copy of a current and valid photo identification. The Help America Vote Act, 42 U.S. Code 15483, paragraph B, or section B, doesn't consider or discuss very weak forms of identification like health club identification cards, credit cards, or employee identification cards. Yet this particular section of these proposed rules does list out these fairly weak forms of identification. I call them weak because what is a health club membership and what does it tell you, if anything, about that person, right? It's very weak. As is an employee identification card, because these things can be easily ginned up. And again, it doesn't really tell you who this person is. It's just a mugshot of somebody on a piece of plastic. And I don't think that's exactly where the Help America Vote Act was going with this. And again, since these particularly weak forms of identification aren't specifically listed there, I question why they're here. I do know and acknowledge that the Secretary of State's office, in rules that they promulgated for procuring a voter ID card, does have these weak forms of identification in their promulgated rules, but those rules aren't what should be driving your rulemaking here. You should be guided by the Help America Vote Act and other federal laws instead. So I just wanted to highlight that. I think that those particular...
I have a question about this.
Yes.
You're right, there is some attempt to harmonize the regulatory structure that this agency has with the Secretary of State. When you said that they're weak forms of identification, do you think that they're weaker than the other documents you can provide under B, including a copy of a current utility bill?
So, professionally, yes, I consider that a particularly weak one. They're very easy to manipulate. My 8th grader can manipulate my utility bill, scan it, and turn it into anyone else's utility bill pretty readily. So,
that's also permitted under HAVA.
yeah, no, I understand that. I do. Like I said, it's one of these things. I personally don't believe that we should have overly weak forms of identification in there. And again, with a health club membership in particular, I mean that's extraordinarily weak. At least the utility bill does have some basic to get an account with a utility company is not necessarily easy to do. To get a gym membership is really not hard to do. so that's the basic gist. But I do acknowledge your point. So that's point number 4. Really one more. So my point number 5 is on page 10. And this is on section 2.A, really in B and C too. So it's It's the paragraph that begins incomplete or defective voter registrations. And this one may take the most explanation. My first concern really starts with paragraph A. And I think there's a logical inconsistency in this paragraph that I just need to describe to you. I don't know if you want to take a minute to read this paragraph first, or if you just want me to go. Okay.
This is on page...
This is on page 10, 2.A. So the inconsistency here is...
There is one, two.
So we have...
Page 11? You need 11.
Page 11.
Okay, my copy shows it's on page 10, but if you're on page 11, that's where it is.
I
But
think I may have sent this to you. The one that the board has is
Oh.
color-coded in accordance with the...
I see. I'm reading the one that doesn't have the markup on it,
I see.
because that was
Okay.
just way too hard for me
Yeah.
to make heads or tails
Right.
out of that.
Yeah.
All right, my apologies. So here's the inconsistency with this paragraph. I'm going to paraphrase what I believe this paragraph is discussing. What it says is, if a first-time voter registers to vote, and for some reason the driver's license check with the DMV or the Social Security number check with the Social Security Administration, if those checks don't pan out, if they don't find a match, what this paragraph then says is that potential voters' information can be checked against the Secretary of State's voter registration data itself. So if it's a first-time voter, they shouldn't have data in the Secretary of State's database in the first place. And if those driver's license and Social Security numbers do show up there, that's pretty problematic, because they're probably not showing up for that voter. They may be there for somebody else. So the basic trouble that I have here as a software engineer is you're talking about looking in a database for confirming information for somebody who should not have that information in that database in the first place because they're a first-time registrant. Did that make sense?
No. But I don't believe that that is the case. I believe that they have the ability to go into the DMV database and pull out the driver's license.
So, but the language in here says
But it comes through the CVRS.
that with data maintained either on the CVRS.
So the information that was provided by the applicant may be either transposed or in some other way inaccurate. This would allow the state agencies to determine whether or not there's some other way to verify that applicant.
Right. So that they can automatically verify the applicant using the other information that's available in the databases.
Right.
If there's an inconsistency caused by misreading or transposition of
So there may be
numbers.
something in the CVRS that reconciles the erroneous data provided by the applicant unwittingly and thereby verify that person
Right.
provided with a unique identifier. By the same token, there can be times when the state has information in one of its databases that's inaccurate. And that's also something that we have to be aware of when we're talking about registrations.
Yeah, and I addressed that. That's my second point here. And again, the dissonance for me was this paragraph discusses a first-time registrant. So if it's a first-time registrant, they shouldn't have data in the CVRS, just logically speaking.
They would.
Okay, but this paragraph says that they could, right? So that, again, maybe it's overly picky, but I just wanted to highlight that and discuss that. And then to Attorney Marcaccio's point, again, paraphrasing the net impact of A, B, and C on this page, one of the things that is proposed in these three paragraphs is that it appears that this language says that data in CVRS can be used to override data coming from either the Social Security Administration or the Department of Motor Vehicles. Now, as a data specialist, this is what I do now. The DMV and the Social Security Administration are considered primary sources of data regarding driver's license information for the DMV and Social Security number information for Social Security numbers. I question the wisdom of using the CVRS, which is not a primary source of that data, it's simply a collector of that data, to override what those two primary sources are telling you.
But can't it be used to reconcile the data? So for example, you have someone who earlier in their life may have gone by Susie Prescott and now wants to go by a more formal Suzanne Prescott, and that there may be some need to reconcile what may be on a different database but not exactly the same. So someone says that they have a formal name of their maiden name, suddenly now they're using a hyphenated name. It seems that what we're trying to accomplish here is to make sure that the reliance upon certain data doesn't become an unnecessary barrier to the voter registration process, but does become a way that the agency, the state, can satisfy the important role of HAVA, which is to make sure that each person gets a unique identifier when they're a new registrant.
And that's really the key, is the unique identifier.
That's key. And if the state can do so, if it can accomplish that task by reconciling different databases, the applicant should not be unnecessarily burdened or prohibited. There shouldn't be, this version attempts to make sure there are no administrative barriers to the franchise. That's the key.
So, and I understand that, and if it's a fine distinction, for instance, Madge versus Marjorie, or something along those lines, or maybe a transposition of a middle initial, that makes perfect sense to me. But if the Social Security Administration comes back to you and says that Social Security number doesn't exist, I think that's a different scenario, because now your primary source for that is telling you this doesn't check, right? And so maybe this particular paragraph might need a little bit more to it, where, and I think it's perfectly okay to use a collector database to help smooth over the fine points, right? You know, transposition of letters or that sort of thing. But I think you have to rely very heavily on your primary sources for driver's license verification or Social Security number verification. And if those primary sources are telling you there's a problem with the match because those identifiers don't match, that's a different scenario altogether, I would argue.
Bob, do you have any thoughts on
I just know that the way that I perceive the CVRS works is that they can just go out and look and pull back. And so like in your example of Imagine a Margaret, they would go out and try to find a Margaret from that address with that date of birth, with a driver's license.
My concern here is that we don't not register people because of inconsistencies, and the more processes that we have to ensure that there are consistencies in the information, that we identify each individual with a unique identifier being primary purpose of HAVA in this case, that the greatest number of opportunities to do so makes sense.
And I believe that's what we're trying to do.
And that's what it says, yeah.
We're trying to give the voter the most options and possibility to
Right.
make them become a registered.
Because this actually makes it easier for people to register, the sum total of what we've done here. Because we no longer have that ambiguity about whether or not people are, what happens when they don't provide a driver's license or a social security number for the last four. They're registered under the regulation. They just have until election day to present additional information.
Right, unless they don't have it. I mean, there's that small subset of people who affirm that they do not have that, either the Social Security or primarily the driver's license, then the Social Security. They actually go directly to getting a unique identifier.
That's right. Now,
And
instead of
that's
having any
HAVA.
doubt
That's-
about it,
that's HAVA.
that's HAVA.
Mhm.
So they get a unique identifier and they're
Immediate-
registered to vote.
Right.
They're not in any probationary list. They're
Nothing.
immediately registered to vote. So that makes it easier for people to vote.
That's right.
So
There's no
Right.
matching process for those people because they have nothing to match against.
Right.
They immediately get that identifier, which shows that Congress was more concerned, I think, about making sure that everyone has, that are voting rolls, our voting process, make sure that there's a unique number for each person. There's no duplication of registrations. And the other concerns they had back in the early 2000s with the things they were finding nationally.
Right.
So, not to diminish what Mr. Blanc is saying as well, it's just that in my reading of HAVA, there are competing interests that at times almost seem to clash with each other. This is not a easily reconciled.
There's no simple answer.
So, so I'm obviously in this particular section, and I'm not discussing Commissioner Erickson. I'm not talking about the people who stipulate that they don't have both a driver's license and a social security number.
They don't have to even answer that question.
Well, actually, they have to check a box.
No, they don't.
Is what this says
No,
now.
it doesn't. It says it's not mandatory. If the registration comes in from by mail and that box isn't checked, you're registered.
Well, let's see. Everyone needs to provide that information, whether they're in person or by mail. If they don't by mail, then they need to provide one of these alternative forms of.
No later than election day.
Correct.
So
That's
if somebody just doesn't check the box, they're not required to check the box. It's not mandatory. It says shall, but that's not a mandatory imperative. That's simply saying that there's a box and we're telling them to check it if it's true. But if they choose not to check it, if they leave it empty, then they are registered with a unique identifier. And then thereafter, prior to casting a ballot, they have to present the additional information that's provided for in the statute. So we don't reject mail applications or other applications simply because they haven't checked the box, because the regulation says that under rejected, which is on page 10 of ours, it says the voter registration will not be accepted or processed if they fail to answer the questions regarding age or citizenship, or answer no to either of these questions, or if they fail to sign the form. It doesn't say that the application will be rejected for any other reason. So it doesn't say that the registration is rejected because they didn't check the box.
So with that clarification, I would agree, yes.
Okay.
Rejected applications is addressed in section 1.
So actually, the original analysis that we were getting about this, that somehow it was a lawless attempt to evade HAVA, we're actually making this easier to have people register. Just want to make that clear. This is pro-registration. This is a simpler method for registration and allows people that don't have or choose not to answer the question about driver's license or social security number still have not only the opportunity but the right to register to vote. And that's a positive thing.
And I think critical to all of this is that they can only cast a vote that is counted if they provide this information
Right.
at that time.
Right,
So-
by election day.
By election day.
By election day.
Yeah, so that what we're doing is facilitating the active registration,
Right.
but we're still guarding against improper exercise of
Right.
the franchise.
But the improper exercise that's being guarded against deals not with voter identification, but having, because this is not a voter ID provision. The voter ID provision comes in when you cast your ballot.
No, but they've got to provide this information before.
Right, I mean, HAVA
Right.
speaks about providing that information. That is a required aspect of HAVA for the processing of the application.
Right.
And I just want to bring it back to what I was, because I think we got a little bit off the specific issue that I was talking about. So in the circumstance where a driver's license or where a social security number has been provided and it fails the check with the DMV or the Social Security Administration, that's the issue that I'm concerned about.
Again, that's legitimate. And
Yeah.
even if you look back at the 03 version, you'll see that there's this attempt to reconcile the data, and if you can't, the burden almost shifts back to the applicant to explain why this is not. That's not in this version, because starting in the mid-2000, like around 2005 or so, there are cases that started to develop that argued that you can't have that kind of prohibition. You can't have a no match, no vote requirement by the states. So if, for example, you have a failure to reconcile that data, which is clearly a legitimate concern, and the states attempted to reconcile it and cannot, if the state and the applicant can reconcile it through another source, for example, the voter says, here's my passport, this should address what you're concerned about. And that passport has the information that verifies that this person can be given a unique number, because this passport now addresses, for example, a government error with data information, with the information that the applicant provides, and that's happened. The passport can be then submitted, or some other form of identification that would then address that. So we don't want to make the driver's license / last four Social Security a precondition that if they are not reconciled, there is no way to get a vote.
And that's not what I'm suggesting. What I'm worried about here is in the case of a new registrant who fails that test, what I'm suggesting is that looking to resolve that from within the CVRS as a secondary source of data as opposed to a primary isn't a particularly good way to do it. I don't believe that's valid. You can certainly ask them for a passport or some other form, but to go to your secondary data source, to use that as...
Isn't the CVRS based upon information that's at the DMV?
No, the CVRS is mostly data that is given on the voter registration forms. They then confirm that with the DMV, but they don't have the DMV database pulled out of the DMV and stored in the CVRS, right? What's in CVRS is what are the voters who are registered.
Maybe Bob could.
But they have the ability to go to the DMV database. It's not stored on the CVRS, but they have a way to go and look to find a voter.
Right.
They can do a search.
And those are covered very specifically when you discuss the Division of Motor Vehicles or the Federal Social Security Administration. But when you say CVRS, what you're talking about is looking for that data inside the CVRS database.
To understand what you're saying there's a hierarchy of data that should be used, and in that hierarchy, Social Security would be higher than the data that is in the CVRS.
Oh, 100% yes, because that's the primary source for that data.
I want to hear Bob's response to that.
I agree that you may be right, because we should maybe change the wording that they have the ability to get the information, because it is not information that is on the CVRS.
Well,
It's like
I
a
think the board
pass-through.
should be
Correct.
mindful, though, that there are states that have generated very technical regulations. This regulation
Is broad.
is broad. It's almost, for the consumer, for the people who are generally involved in this process. But there's a technical process that goes on with the verification. Some states actually have regulations that deal with the way that agencies at the state level, the federal government, can speak to each other and get this data verified. This is not the vehicle to do that.
Right.
I do want to consider what Mr. Block has said. I do think that the agencies involved should consider that. I'm not prepared to say that we should change anything at this point, but we should definitely consider what he has said.
You're the expert.
We're thankful for your contribution.
You're very welcome, thank you. I'll leave this with you for what it's worth.
Are those written comments, Mr. Block?
They are.
That would be very helpful.
Thank you
So
for
we
your
should
time.
mark those